Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Thanks for subscribing if you have subscribed already. So let's get started. Today we're going to continue on with functionalism. So just to recap what we did yesterday, we were looking at Murdoch, and Murdoch was writing late 40s and talking about how the nuclear family was universal and found absolutely everywhere in the world. This man, woman and children setup, and how it was the best family at the time because it fulfills 4 functions: the sexual function, the reproduction function, the economic function and the socialization function. We also then moved on to look at Parsons and Parsons' functional fit theory, this idea that the family adapted during industrialisation to fit the needs of society. Before industrialisation, it was more likely to be an extended family, working on the farm, lots of people to help out, a unit of production, produce their own stuff. But then during and after industrialisation, it became much more nuclear, smaller, to make it more geographically mobile and also better kind of economically and more socially mobile because there's less people to provide for. Now, also during this time, the family lost some functions during the process of structural differentiation, the changing structure of society and the institutions that fulfill the functions of society, because the NHS was introduced, the education system was introduced, which took away some of the functions of the family. However, Parsons does suggest that while some of the functions were taken away from the family, it actually meant that they could focus more and become more specialised in terms of 2 essential functions that really can only be done by the nuclear family. So according to Parsons, these 2 essential functions that can only be performed by the nuclear family are the primary socialisation of children, so raising children to be successful members of society, and the stabilisation of adult personalities, which I spoke briefly about yesterday, in terms of it's the place where we all come home to relax and sort of feel better about our day so that the next day we can go back to work or back to whatever it is we need to do to keep society functioning. So stabilisation of adult personalities, also known as the warm bath theory. And also it's worth noting that the letters of the start of each word of stabilisation of adult personalities, that spells soap. So you have a warm bath and it's soap, stabilisation of adult personality, so quite a useful way to just remember it. Okay, so what I thought we would do quickly is just make sure that you're happy with the questions on page 22 in your pack. So let's have a quick look at those. Okay then, so on page 22, we've got this question here that says, provide an example in society of how a family has adapted to the society's economy today. So this is trying to get you to think about Parsons' argument about how the family adapts. And instead of applying it to during industrialisation like Parsons, thinking about society today. So what I might suggest is something like this, that in today's society we might have living apart together families, and that is to adapt to the more global economy that we now have, which means that often people might have to work away from home, abroad and that kind of thing, if they're part of sort of international business and that kind of thing. So we might have more living apart together families because they've adapted to the needs of society today. The next question says, explain how the emerging isolated nuclear family fits the needs of this new economy that emerged after industrialisation. So Parsons is arguing that it fitted the needs of the economy because it had less people in it, so it could easily move and be more socially mobile. So it's this geographic and social mobility thing again. So that's just an application question really to check you understand why it's more suitable. Next page, 23, give examples of functions the family used to have that are now carried out by other agencies. So the two main examples really are healthcare and education, because they used to be done within the family, and of course now they're done by the NHS and the education system. And how did childhood emerge during this period? Children no longer worked in the family and instead went to school. So this meant that for the first time really children were sort of separate from adults during the day, because previously when we'd been a unit of consumption, everyone living together, they would have kind of all been together really for much of the day. But now this meant that children and adults were separate, so it's how childhood began to emerge. Moving on to Parsons, still on page 23. What norms and values do children learn, and how does this help them in society? You may have written something about like manners and the difference between right and wrong, and that this allows them to live in society in agreement with everyone and sort of peacefully, etc. What does irreducible mean? It actually means that it can't be reduced or simplified. So it's kind of saying that it's such a vital function. These two functions are so vital, primary socialisation and stabilisation of adult personalities, that they can't be reduced. You can't just half do it, and you can't kind of simplify them, and they can only really be done by the family. So they're really important and can only really be done by the family. And finally, the stabilisation of adult personalities. Why is this functional for the efficiency of the economy? It's because adults feel refreshed after a night at home with their family, and then they can continue to work, so that contributes to the economy. Now remember, you can keep pausing this video and you can rewind and things if you want to go back for any of those answers. Okay, so a little bit more Parsons. Parsons also described this newly emerging nuclear family as having two very essential roles. So he argued that the two roles were the instrumental role, which was naturally taken on by the male, and the expressive role, which was naturally taken on by the female. So Parsons, although he was a sociologist, he believed that these roles had been sort of divided in this way due to the biological nature of the two sexes. So Parsons sort of suggested that the male in sort of basic and undeveloped societies has always been the hunter and the person that brings home the food and resources and things. So in that sense, when industrialization happened, it would be the man that would go out to work and get food, well, get money to get food and clothes, etc. for the family. So that's the instrumental role. The expressive role, Parsons argues, is biologically suited to the female, because this involves being the caregiver, bringing up the children, and dealing with any of the emotion work. So if you need to remember this, the expressive role is about expressing emotion and taking care of people, etc. Whereas the instrumental role is the more kind of practical, get the money for the food, that kind of thing. So very clear that it was men that were the instrumental breadwinner role and women were the expressive role. So you've got a question in your pack which says, what other duties may the instrumental and expressive, should we say, roles carry out? So you might want to write some things down here about how the housewife in the expressive role would also do the emotion work, looking after the children when they're sick, probably like making dinner for the family, making sure that everyone's okay. Whereas the instrumental role, the breadwinner, etc., the other things that they might do might include things like fixing things around the house. Again, that's instrumental, that's a practical thing, DIY, gardening, that kind of thing. Evaluation question. Are the roles in the family based on biological differences today? So I'd like you to pause this video and have a think. what are the roles like in your family? Is there a clear sort of instrumental and expressive role? Think about other families that you know as well. Is it the case that we still have this like sexual division of labour in the same way, where the man is instrumental, the breadwinner, and the woman is the expressive, emotional caregiver? And write down some of your ideas there. Okay, once you've had a think about that, the second thing to consider is what might a feminist suggest about the assumption that roles are based on biological differences between men and women. So a feminist would criticise that view and argue that it's socially constructed. And I want you to think about some more detail there. Why would they criticise it so much? Why is the woman being in the expressive role not a good thing for that woman? So you need to think about things like power. Who has the most power in this situation? Who has the most freedom? Who has financial power? All those kinds of things. So pause the video if you need to. I'm going to move on to some evaluation points for Parsons' entire argument. So the first question that you've got to evaluate Parsons on page 24 is, has the family really lost all of its other functions apart from these two, primary socialisation and stabilisation of adults? So a sociologist called Fletcher argued that actually the family gained more functions after industrialisation. And this is because childhood became more extended, meaning that children were dependent for much longer than they were before. So actually, the home doesn't just primarily socialise children, it also prepares them for adult life. It also takes care of them when they're unwell, and provides resources for them for much longer economically, like providing food and things for them. So actually the functions of the family have grown because childhood now lasts for longer, because they're no longer just like working on the farm. It's become a very separate and special time of life, whereby children are very dependent on their parents. And also feminists would argue that the health and welfare functions have not actually been lost and are still carried out by women. So very often, you know, we might go to hospital and to the doctors if we're quite seriously ill, but if we are just feeling a bit under the weather, the women in the family tend to be the ones who are giving the care and attention to the sick members of the family. So for this reason, feminists argue that the family is actually not a warm bath for all adults. It doesn't stabilise all adult personalities. It stabilises the men. And often the family is not a warm bath for women. It's the place where they do all of their work, their emotional labour and housework and all of that kind of stuff. So pause if you need to write any extra notes. Question 2, was the extended family dominant in pre-industrial society? So remember, Parsons says that before industrialisation, families were all extended. Now, sociologist called Laslett argues that actually that can't have been true, because life expectancy was really short before industrialisation. So we wouldn't have had these big extended families because people wouldn't have lived long enough to become grandparents. So Laslett argues that actually these smaller families of 2 generations were probably more common. And it's difficult to know because it was obviously a long time ago. We have some census records and things, but they sort of often say different things. They're not recorded as accurately as they might be today. So it's difficult to know, but Laslett argues that we probably wouldn't have lived in extended families before industrialisation anyway, because people didn't live long enough to be grandparents. Question number 3, did the family actually become nuclear during industrialisation? So some people actually argue, like Anderson and Willmott and Young, that we did have extended families before industrialisation. They agree with Parsons there. But actually that the extended family continued during industrialisation and even became actually more important. Because if you're going to pick up your family from the countryside and move them into the city, you need support from your extended family members. if the parents are going to go out to work and earn money for the family, grandparents are probably actually very important in terms of providing childcare and just emotional support for this kind of big upheaval in life. So some sociologists argue that actually we were extended and we stayed extended. So there's much debate about the size of the family before and after industrialisation. And lastly, question number 4, is the extended family no longer important in modern society? So actually, still in today's society, extended families are still important in many social groups. So for example, in South Asian culture, I'm never sure how to pronounce this, Berthoud something, found that in South Asian culture, extended families are still very important. So it's not really correct to say that we were all extended and then we all became nuclear, because that's actually very sort of, only focusing on UK society and not thinking about other cultures. And of course, other cultures now are part of British society, and so therefore got to take them into account. Also, Litwack argues that extended families are still very important today, but they're just modified. They're modified extended families who stay in touch over the phone or over Skype and technology and things. They might meet up a few times a year or something, but they know what each other are up to via Facebook and that kind of thing. So extended families are still important, but they're just different. It's not that they're not important after industrialisation. We just connect differently. And finally, sociologist called Brannan has found that there has been a huge growth in beanpole families due to longer life expectancy. So because people are living for longer, we now value grandparents much, much more than we may have done in the past, because they are sticking around for longer. They're living for longer and they're a bigger part of family life because of that. Okay, I'm going to take a brief pause and I suggest that you do as well, and just have a quick look back over all of those evaluation questions and check that you are happy with them and that you understand them, and email me if there's anything you're not sure of. Okay. So I've got here a slide for you with some questions on. This is just for you to quickly test yourself and see how you get on. And what I'm going to suggest that you do again is pause this video, look at these 8 questions, write down the numbers, and then write next to it whether this was something that was said by Parsons, Murdoch, or both. And then I'm going to suggest that you look back through your pack in order to find the answers and check your answers afterwards. So test yourself. We've got to make sure that while we're doing this remote learning, we're still trying to do a bit of testing and checking that you've understood things. So test yourself and see how you get on. Okay, we're then going to move on to looking at our last key thinkers for functionalism. Now, if you have a look in your pack with me, you'll notice that Willmott and Young were writing in 1972, so much, much later than both Murdoch and Parsons. So Willmott and Young agree that the family went from extended to nuclear. So they agree with him there. They argue that families maintained some links to extended family members for support, but that they lived in these isolated nuclear family structures. So they agree with Parsons in that sense. But they argue, as they're writing a bit later, that between sort of the 50s and the 70s, there's been another development in the nuclear family, and the family actually then started to become more and more symmetrical. So symmetrical obviously means the same on 2 sides. So in this sense, it means that the family became a bit more equal. So we'll talk about that a bit more now. So in your notes on separate paper, I'd suggest that you write this down, these points here on this table, and I'm just going to talk through them. So when I'm talking about this stage 2 nuclear family, I'm talking there about Parsons, so I'll just put a P here. Oh, there we go. So Parsons' idea of the stage 2 nuclear family after industrialisation. And then Willmott and Young argue that as we move into sort of the 70s, things have changed again. So we've got Willmott and Young there. So Parsons argues that we had segregated conjugal roles, with the woman in the expressive role and the man in the instrumental role. This word conjugal, it means sort of within a marriage or a relationship. So segregated roles within a marriage. If you need a way to remember it, when you watch programs like Prison Break and Orange is the New Black and things like that, anything with a prison, you'll see that the prisoners have conjugal visits, and that's visits from their wives or whatever. So that's what it means. It means because they're married. Anyway, so we used to have these segregated conjugal roles, but nowadays these conjugal roles have become more symmetrical, more equal. Both men and women work, and they both do a bit more domestic work in the home. So men are starting to do more housework at the same time as women are starting to do more work, paid work. Back in the earlier nuclear family stage, just after industrialisation, leisure time tended to take place outside of the home with friends, and it was mostly men that would be involved in this. You know, traditionally women might have had coffee mornings around their houses and stuff, but men would probably be in the pub after work. Whereas Willmott and Young argue that the family has started to spend much more time together now. It's not so traditional. I mean, if you think about in your own families, if you live with mum and dad, if dad was going out to the pub every night and not spending time with the family, mum might be a bit upset about that, particularly if mum is also working. So the leisure time has become much more family centred, takes place in the home, for example, watching TV together and that kind of thing. So Willmott and Young argue that in this nuclear family just after industrialisation, there were still some links with extended family maintained for support, but they argue that we've had this privatisation of the nuclear family later on, whereby we've kind of got less contact with our extended family, still a little bit, but less contact, because we really place all of our sort of value and consider our families to be the ones that we live with, and they are sort of the most important to us. So make sure you've got this table written down, because it is a bit of a helpful way of looking at it. And it's also worth noting that Willmott and Young would argue that this is a march of progress. We call them march of progress sociologists because they are suggesting that things are becoming better in society. We're making progress towards better society, more equality, and the family being kind of, well, better for everyone in it. So just to take a minute to go back to your pack, you've got a question in there that says, why does a nuclear privatised family suit industrial society better than an extended family? Oh, did we do that one? No. So this is similar to Parsons' argument. Again, it's the idea that they're socially and geographically mobile, so therefore fits the economy better. But some people have some criticisms to make of Willmott and Young's argument. For example, feminists would argue that the symmetrical family is a myth and families are still really unequal, because they would argue that women working now means that they are actually suffering a dual burden. So this dual burden comes from women doing paid work and also still doing the bulk of the housework. So two different types of work that the women are now doing. And it was Anne Oakley is the feminist. Sorry, this is awful, but oh well. It was Anne Oakley is the feminist that argued that women actually have a dual burden nowadays. So this might resonate with some of you in your own families if you've got man and a woman at home, whereby the woman probably has a job but also still does most of the domestic work, most of the sort of like looking after the children, cleaning and cooking, However, some of you may disagree. Some of you might feel that you are Willmott and Young's symmetrical family, and that people, the two roles in the family are very similar. So yes, evaluation of Willmott and Young is that feminists would argue it's not true, and that women actually have a dual burden, dual meaning two, paid work and housework, and it's Oakley that argues that. So that kind of brings us to the end of the functionalists. So before you move on to some more consolidation stuff, have a look at these 8 questions again, please. And on your separate paper, I'd like you to see if you can answer these from memory. And then again, go back and check your answers using your pack and ask me if there are any you're not sure about. So give me an email or anything like that. So this is one bit of consolidation for you. And I want to see that you've done this as well. And once you've done that, I've got a couple of other bits for you. I'd like you to complete the key thinker list on page 24 with just a really brief summary of what each of those key thinkers argue. I'd like you to do the key concepts on page 25, and I think I might complete that and send you a picture of it completed so you can make sure you've got the answers. I'm also going to send you an example of a 20 marker on functionalism and the family. So I'd like you to make sure that you read it and then do what we usually do, where you highlight key concepts and highlight evaluation and highlight application to the question. But I'll send the instructions for that as well. And finally, you've got a 20 marker in your pack, sorry, a 10 marker in your pack on page 26. Outline and explain 2 ways in which the family functions to meet the needs of society. So reasonably straightforward question, and I'd like you to have a go at coming up with 2 points. So 2 ways that the family functions to meet the needs of society. Okay.